Margaret Ann, what is dementia?
Well, it's not as simple a question as it may sound, because there's a lot of confusion in the public mind about what it actually is, and there's confusion. So I prefer to read a definition from somebody, an organisation I trust, and in this case I've got a definition from the Alzheimer's Research UK, which I'd like to just share with you. The brain controls everything we think, feel, say and do, and it's not just memory. There are diseases that stop a person's brain from working properly. When a person has had one of these diseases, they may have problems remembering, thinking and speaking. They might say or do things that seem strange to others, and it's harder for them to do everyday things. They make the person not seem like the person they used to be. Doctors use this word dementia to describe these different problems. Technically, medically, it's a syndrome. It's a collection of symptoms gathering together, which you always get in dementia.
And it's a degenerative
And it's a progressive
condition.
and degenerative and incurable condition.
Okay.
It affects the brain in different ways. The brain cells die in different areas of the brain for different reasons. When we looked at the section on the discoveries that were made by Alzheimer and Lewy, for instance, you see that there are different areas of the brain which are affected. Damage is most common in the grey matter. That's the structural of the brain. And so the structures will be destroyed, causing the brain to shrink in size. Damage to the white matter means that the connections between the bits of the brain, all the areas of the brain talking to each other, are lost. The cerebral cortex is the most important part of the brain as far as modern man is concerned. It's the thinking, intelligent part of the brain, and that gets affected really quite early on. The cells of the brain are called neurons, and the messages, of course, are passed from one to the other using two systems. The first system is electrical, and the second is chemical. Well, we can't do anything about the electrical system, but we can do something about the chemicals, and that is where the drugs that are currently being used for the symptomatic treatment of Alzheimer's are being used. They're changing the chemical component in the brain. So the problems, such as the build-up of amyloid and tau, the proteins which Alzheimer found built up in the brain, mean trouble, basically. We like to think of the word dementia, as I said, it's actually a woolly, difficult word, and it's actually, according to as the doctors use it, a syndrome of symptoms. So it's an umbrella term.
Okay.
And so let's just look at the different elements that make up the umbrella. 60% of cases are Alzheimer's disease. By far the most common, by far the most researched. Vascular dementia, and then a mixture of vascular dementia and Alzheimer's, which is known as mixed dementia. Those two together, e.g. problems with the blood supply to the brain, account for 20 to 30% of cases. And then Lewy body dementia, surprisingly, is much more common than we ever used to think. And this, I think, it's as our imaging. The imaging has improved so much, and they've learnt more and more and more about diagnosing. And so we're learning more and more about the different types of dementia. So Lewy body is responsible for 10 to 25% of cases. You've also got frontotemporal dementia, which just affects the frontal lobe, largely affecting behaviour initially. And then you've got the other dementias, loads of them. because they say that there are well over 100 dementias.
Right.
These other dementias would be anything to do with a neurodegenerative disease such as Parkinson's, Huntington's, motor neuron disease, muscular dystrophy, any of those kind of things have a dementia associated with them. There is also the category of young onset dementia. That means anybody under the age of 65. That term has changed over the years, but we seem to have finally settled on young onset. Anybody under the age of 65, and this is 5% of all cases. I should add just the caveat that we do know that a large percentage of people with dementia are not yet being diagnosed. So these figures are kind of provisional,
right?
Really.
And I think it can take a long time to actually realise that there's an issue, and then from that point to actually get to
get a diagnosis. And currently it's taking a long time for people, which is obviously having an effect in lots of other areas.
And I think the cognitive changes, the chemical changes that are happening in the brain are happening many years before the symptoms are actually apparent.
You're absolutely right. This is relatively new. In terms of my working life, I'd probably say this has only been known in the last few years. But they now say that they can identify the changes in the brain on a scan 15 years before there are any changes in behaviour,
right?
Which is what gives us the clue that there's something wrong.
Yes.
So we should be backtracking to middle age if we're on the prevention track, which is probably where we should be. We should be focusing a lot more attention on looking after your brain. What's good for your heart is good for your brain.
Yes.
In those middle years.
So it is a very complex and complicated picture, as you said.
As I said, it is. It's not at all simple.
You mentioned vascular dementia. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Vascular dementia used to be known as multi-infarct dementia back in the day, many small strokes, but they've now broadened the definition to include any type of problem that occurs in the blood supply to the brain. The brain uses 20% of the total amount of oxygen that our body needs, and so it's really, really crucial to the functioning of being well and staying well. There is unfortunately no medication, no treatment. It's all about prevention. And interestingly, in the last few years, it seems to be being added on to the spectrum of heart disease. And so, we all know this saying, what's good for your heart is good for your brain. So all the things that we all know so well, eat your 5 vegetables a day, don't be stressed, do exercise, don't be overweight, don't smoke. All these things are the same advice as are given to prevent vascular dementia.
What are some of are there any sort of more specific symptoms of vascular dementia?
It's more erratic than Alzheimer's. I think Alzheimer's starts imperceptibly. There used to be a video doing the rounds years ago called The Thief in the Night, where a man with Alzheimer's described how his brain had been stolen away like a thief in the night. He didn't realise he was losing it. Whereas with vascular dementia, it starts with a distinct episode, a mini stroke, a transient ischemic attack, a TIA. But you would know, one day you're okay and the next day something's happened. It may take several of these TIAs before you get any symptoms of dementia, and it can arise from mini strokes. But it's much more up and down. And you may have plateaus of period of time when the person really doesn't change very much at all. They may retain self-awareness much more, and interestingly, memory is not the main issue. With Alzheimer's disease, it is the main issue, and unfortunately, all of us now think dementia equals memory loss, but it doesn't. And in vascular dementia, it may not really be a big factor for some time.
I've heard that some people experience sort of depressive thoughts and can become quite sort of, I don't know, sort of reclusive and sort of lose their motivation with vascular dementia.
Yes, I've heard that too. I think it's a probably perfectly explainable response to the insight that you are losing your abilities, because you're far more likely to retain insight, I think, with vascular dementia as well. And so that can lead, on to depression. And we're talking about that later.
And with Alzheimer's, it's more about that sort of losing that insight. It's quite an early sort of feature.
Yes, it can be. And the thing is about all these symptoms, they can occur at any stage. And so you can't really tell people, well, this is what's happened and now this is going to happen and then that. It's not like that. People are all different. And that's what makes looking after people with dementia so challenging and so interesting, and why we work so hard to treat people as individuals.
So it's sort of looking beyond the dementia the person.
It's looking beyond the dementia to the person, exactly, Sarah. Yeah. We come on to the question of medication, just because most people currently are on medication. There's a group of drugs that were invented in the mid-90s called the cholinesterase inhibitors, and basically they identified that choline is the enzyme that is the problem in Alzheimer's. It's not being passed from cell A to cell B to cell C because there's not enough choline. And so these drugs were developed to artificially stimulate production of choline. All they do is treat the symptoms, they don't treat the disease. And so most people will be familiar with one of these. The most commonly prescribed is donepezil, but there's also Reminil and Exelon. And then there's another group of drugs called ACE inhibitors, and memantine is used these days, seems to be used in common with donepezil, very commonly, together with donepezil. But these drugs are not doing anything except to slow down the progress of the deterioration in some people for a time-limited period. There is a new drug on the horizon, which is the very first drug to be invented, which will actually change the disease. Because what it does, apparently, is it destroys the protein amyloid, which is responsible in Alzheimer's for most of the damage. And it is capable of actually stopping the disease by about 20% of cases. It is under production. It's called lecanemab, and it's a question of watch this space. I don't think it's going to make a great deal of difference to our work, because it's going to be apparently only useful for people with mild cognitive impairment or in the very early stages of Alzheimer's. Right. And therefore, I don't think most people will benefit from it.
So it sort of calls for very early sort of screening.
It calls for very early screening. And there's now this idea about the blood test. There's a blood test around where they can actually screen for Alzheimer's. And they now know that the symptoms, that the changes in the brain can be seen on scans 15 years before there are any symptoms. So we're talking about prevention in middle age as a long-term strategy. Whether there will ever be a cure, I think, is a moot point.
So it's about thinking about lifestyle changes in midlife, really, isn't
It
it?
is really.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a big change in our thinking, isn't it?